I want to talk about the book of Exodus in this chapter. The book of Exodus is very important because it, perhaps more than any other book in the Hebrew Bible, shows us how definitive is the experience of the Exodus for the ancient Israelites, both for their imagination as to who they are as a people, and also for the identity that they assume afterwards. Let me unpack that. It is kind of a refrain throughout the Hebrew Bible that this is a people that were slaves in Egypt, from where God had delivered them. So they see themselves as former slaves, but also as people who had been liberated by this God Yahweh. And secondly, the book of Exodus, of course, contains the beginning of the legislation, the beginning of the laws that begin in Exodus 20 with the so-called Ten Commandments, and that then provide the second aspect of the identity of these people as a people that are bound to Yahweh by way of laws, laws that define their relationship as one of obedience and allegiance. As long as the Israelites are obedient to the laws, Yahweh will protect them and give them his blessings. The book of Exodus represents really a partial fulfillment of the promises that God had made to Abraham. Of course, by the end of the book, the Israelites are still not in the land. They have been taken out of Egypt. That is taking them only a part of the way, but they are not in the land. They still are far from receiving the full package, as it were. So the book balances the initial theme of liberation from human tyranny with emphasis on Israel's legal and ethical responsibilities to its divine liberator, as I explained just a minute ago. We'll say some more about this in a minute or two. Through the Torah, which, as you by now know, is a word that can be translated in a multiplicity of ways. Perhaps the best one might be instruction or teaching. Through this Torah given to Moses on Mount Sinai, Yahweh introduces the new paradigm, namely that to benefit from God's patronage, from God's protection, Israel must obey legal and ritual obligations, regulations. So in other words, what we have here in the book of Exodus is a relationship that is characterized as a conditional covenant. And we'll say some more about that in a minute. I have already said this at the beginning of the slide, that the book of Exodus is momentous in the understanding of the Israelites and their faith. We suggested earlier this semester that God's covenant with Abraham is unilateral. Namely, God makes a series of promises to Abraham, but this covenant at Sinai is bilateral. In other words, it's conditional. The Israelites have obligations, and Yahweh has obligations. Saying some more about that, the Israelites have the obligation to be faithful to the covenant by way of keeping the covenant stipulations, the covenant conditions, which are the laws. And Yahweh has obligations which are to protect the people and to give them the blessings that are connected then to the covenant. Let's talk about Israel in Egypt. There is no hard evidence of the presence of the Israelites in Egypt. I have listened to Egyptologists, people that actually spend their lives doing archaeology and study of ancient Egypt, and they say that there is no archaeological evidence, there is, for that matter, there is no textual evidence, there is no monumental evidence, monumental referring to monuments, inscriptions that would place Israel in Egypt. What we have is the textual evidence of the Bible that seems to suggest so strongly that the ancestors of the Israelites had been slaves in Egypt, and from there Yahweh had taken them out. If there was an exodus, the scholars that affirm this would say that the probable setting then was the 19th dynasty, that is dated roughly through the 14th century, the end of the 14th century, and then the middle of the 13th century. So generally a date for the Exodus that is given, that you may find in many textbooks, is the middle of the 13th century, around 1230, 1240, 1230, and so forth. The Bible says that the Israelites spent upwards of 400 years in Egypt. Other scholars actually suggest that if the Israelites were indeed in Egypt, their presence there lasted no more than 4 generations. You can find more about that in the textbook. Moses is regarded as the founder of Yahweh's faith. Moses is I would say, next to God, because God is, of course, the main character in this story in the Pentateuch, as the liberator, as the creator, as the person that actually makes events happen in human history. So next to Yahweh, Moses takes also the stage, and he is a lawgiver, as the one that receives the laws from God and delivers them to the people. He's a prophet, he's a judge, he's a military leader. At the same time, Moses provides a model of humble service, but also he is an example of man's inability to achieve perfect righteousness. We have stories of how Moses kind of breaks down under pressure, and has also his own shortcomings. He has fits of anger, and perhaps given the comings and goings and his and the difficulty of leading these people, he has bouts of depression. You can read about that in the Bible, both in the book of Exodus as well as the book of Numbers. There are stories that actually suggest that. Let's talk about these two revelations of the divine name, and here what I mean is the tetragrammaton Yahweh, right? Yod-Heh, rather YHWH, which are the 4 letters of Yahweh's name. We read as early as Genesis 2 that the divine name is being used there in the second creation story. Moreover, we read that people had worshipped this God Yahweh even before the flood in Genesis 6. Nevertheless, we find in the book of Exodus that the divine name was not known prior to God revealing it to Moses. And here we have two theophanies. Theophany is a word of Greek origin that means revelation of God. We have two theophanies. One is in Moses' encounter with God in Exodus 3, and the second one is when God appears a second time to Moses in the wilderness in Exodus 6. You can read those stories. Exodus 3 is one, and then Exodus 6. Nevertheless, for those of you that are perceptive, you may notice that the two texts actually associate Yahweh with the wilderness of Midian. So that area of the world that is east of the Sinai Peninsula. Let's talk about the escape of the Israelites from Egypt. As I suggested before, this is the pivotal event in the story of Israelites' salvation, right? Israelites remember this as a momentous event in their own history. And the story of the Exodus, if anything, is a story that links Yahweh to the liberation of these people. So Yahweh is a liberator. Yahweh is a God that doesn't tolerate oppression and will mobilize to free people from oppression. When the Israelites leave Egypt, they don't immediately arrive in the mountain where they are going to receive the laws, in the mountain where they are going to be worshiping Yahweh. So we have a long journey until that happens. Moreover, we have that the law narrative that begins with the call of Abraham in Genesis 12 reaches its culmination in Exodus 19. So here, this is important. We have a long narrative that begins with God's promises to Abraham, Genesis 12, and then we come to Exodus 19, where the people sitting at the foot of Mount Sinai or Horeb, right? This is the mountain where they're going to be receiving the laws, starting with the Decalogue or the Ten Commandments. Of course, the Ten Commandments is not or are not the totality of the law. There are many other laws. Scholars of Judaism point to 613 laws. As a matter of fact, following the Ten Commandments, we find another body of legislation at the end of chapter 20 that runs all the way to the end of chapter 23, and that scholars know as the Book of the Covenant. That includes a series of laws referring to a settled society. They deal with instructions for how to deal with civil cases. Then we have an incident in Exodus 32 where the Israelites are growing impatient because of Moses' absence. They decide then to fashion a golden calf. Actually, the one that does that for them is Moses' brother Aaron. That prompts then the rage of Yahweh, who punishes a number of people. Then we close the book with instructions for the tabernacle in chapters 25 to 31, and then the actual construction of the tabernacle in Exodus 35 to 40. And that then brings us to the end of the book of Exodus. I wish you all happy reading.